So a while back, a friend of mine and myself, we were having a discussion of where we might like to move if we ever wanted to leave the United States. And invariably the discussion led to perhaps moving to Canada someday. At the time we were having that discussion, I had already known that because I was already retired that I did not have an easy in to being an immigrant to Canada. Because at that time, Canada did not have any kind of provision for retirees to immigrate to Canada and settle there. However, recently, in December of 2025, Canada liberalized some of their citizenship by descent laws, and me as a genealogist, it perked my curiosity because I happen to have an ancestor from Canada. And so I thought it might be a good idea to go through the history of Canadian citizenship. So I prepared many slides that show a timeline of Canadian citizenship. Please stick with me to the end of this video because then I'm going to show you how those laws might or might not impact me. Canadian citizenship timeline. Before 1867, British subjects. Before Canadian Confederation, the colonies that eventually became Canada were part of the British Empire. People born in what is now Canada were generally British subjects under British law. There was no Canadian citizenship. Immigration and naturalization were largely matters of British imperial and colonial law. 1867, Canadian Confederation. July 1st, 1867. The Dominion of Canada was created through the British North America Act, now the Constitution Act 1867. However, Canada did not create Canadian citizenship. People living in Canada continued to be legally regarded primarily as British subjects, although Canada increasingly developed its own rules concerning immigration and naturalization. 1880s through the 1910s, Canadian naturalization develops. Canada began developing its own nationality and naturalization legislation. A particularly important law was the Naturalization Act of 1881, which established Canadian procedures for naturalization. A person who immigrated to Canada could therefore become a naturalized British subject through Canadian authorities rather than necessarily going through a process directly administered by Britain. This period can be particularly important for genealogy because an ancestor who immigrated to Canada might appear in records as a British subject rather than as a Canadian citizen. 1910. Immigration and citizenship concepts become more distinct. Canada's Immigration Act of 1910 strengthened Canada's control over immigration. At this point, Canada was developing a distinct Canadian national identity and immigration system, but legally Canadians were still British subjects rather than Canadian citizens. I wanted to pause for a moment right here because these are important dates in my own ancestral timeline. My great-grandmother was born in Quebec in 1871. However, when she was barely a year old, she moved with her parents in 1872 to the United States of America. And then later on in 1890, at barely 18 years old, she got married. And so that may be important as we get to the end of the video and I show you how the citizenship laws in Canada might or might not impact myself. 1914 through 1918, World War I. World War I accelerated the development of separate Canadian national identity. Canada participated in the war as a dominion of the British Empire, but increasingly acted independently in international affairs. 1919. Canada signs the Treaty of Versailles. Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain. This was an important milestone in Canada's development as an independent nation, although Canadians were still legally British subjects. 1921. Canadian citizenship/nationality becomes more distinct. Canada introduced the concept of a Canadian national in legislation. This did not yet mean Canadian citizenship in the modern sense. A Canadian could simultaneously be Canadian national plus British subject. This distinction becomes important when interpreting older Canadian immigration and naturalization records. 1922. Canadian Nationals Act. Canada formally established the status of Canadian national. The law essentially recognized people who had a sufficiently strong connection to Canada as Canadian nationals while retaining their status as British subjects. 1931. Statute of Westminster. This was one of the most important steps toward Canadian independence. The Statute of Westminster, 1931, recognized the legislative independence of Canada and the other dominions. Canada was now substantially autonomous from Britain, although some constitutional ties remained. Importantly, however, there still wasn't a separate Canadian citizenship. 1946. Canadian Citizenship Act. This is the key date. Canada enacted the Canadian Citizenship Act, 1946. It came into force on January 1st, 1947. For the first time, Canada had its own legally defined status of Canadian citizen. So as you can see, Canada spent an awful long time acting independently and having a Canadian national identity without having Canadian citizenship. 1867 through 1946, basically. That's an awful long time if you ask me. January 1st, 1947, Canadian citizenship begins. This is generally considered the birth of modern Canadian citizenship. The first Canadian citizens included people who were already British subjects and had the required Canadian connection. Among others, citizenship was generally acquired by people born in Canada, certain people born abroad to Canadian parents, certain British subjects who had Canadian domicile, and people who had been naturalized in Canada. This is particularly important for genealogy. Someone born in Canada in 1900 wasn't technically a Canadian citizen in 1900 because Canadian citizenship didn't yet exist. They could nevertheless become a Canadian citizen automatically when the 1947 Act came into effect. 1947 through 1976, Canadian Citizenship Act era. The 1946 Act governed Canadian citizenship for almost 3 decades. There were various provisions concerning citizenship by birth, citizenship by descent, naturalization, loss of citizenship, women in citizenship, children born outside Canada. One particularly important issue for genealogists is that citizenship by descent was considerably more restrictive than it is today. 1977, Major New Citizenship Act. On February 15, 1977, Canada's current Citizenship Act came into effect, replacing the 1946 Act. It substantially changed Canadian citizenship law. Among other things, it eliminated the concept of citizenship being automatically lost after a period of residence abroad, changed rules concerning citizenship by descent, made dual citizenship possible, and simplified some aspects of naturalization. 2009, First Generation Limit. Canada significantly changed citizenship by descent rules on April 17, 2009. The basic rule became that a Canadian citizen born outside Canada could generally transmit citizenship to one generation born abroad. For example, Canadian citizen, child born outside Canada, generally a Canadian citizen, but Canadian citizen, child born abroad, grandchild born abroad could encounter the first generation limit. This became an extremely important issue for Canadians and their descendants living outside Canada. 2015, Citizenship Restoration Changes. Further amendments restored citizenship to some people who had previously lost Canadian citizenship because of older provisions of Canadian law. 2017, Bill C-6. Major citizenship changes came into effect in 2017. Among other things, Canada reduced some physical presence requirements for naturalization, removed the requirement for applicants to maintain an intention to live in Canada, changed some language and knowledge requirements, and restored certain citizenship rights. 2023 through 2024. Citizenship by descent litigation. The first generation limit became the subject of significant litigation. The Federal Court of Canada ruled in 2023 that portions of the first generation limit were unconstitutional. Canada subsequently introduced legislation intended to address this issue. 2024 through 2025. Bill C-71. Canada proposed major changes to citizenship by descent through Bill C-71, which was intended to replace the rigid first-generation rule with a requirement involving a parent's substantial connection to Canada. However, the legislative process became complicated by parliamentary developments. 2025 through 2026. Bill C-3. Removal of the first generation limit. Ends the rule that restricted automatic citizenship by descent strictly to the first generation born abroad. Allows Canadian parents born or adopted abroad to pass on their citizenship to children born outside Canada. The substantial connection test requires a Canadian parent born or adopted abroad to have at least 1,095 cumulative days, 3 years, of physical presence in Canada. This presence must be completed before the birth or adoption of the child in order to pass down the citizenship. Retroactive recognition. Automatically and retroactively grant citizenship to individuals born abroad to Canadian parents before December 15, 2025, who were excluded under older laws. Clears a path for second generation and beyond individuals to be recognized as citizens from birth if their family meets the updated framework. So how does the elimination of the first generation limit affect me? Well, it depends. As I mentioned earlier, my great-grandmother was born in 1871, and she moved to the United States of America in 1872 with her parents. By 1890, when she was 18, she got married. So the question is going to be, did my great-grandmother establish a sufficient enough connection to Canada to be able to pass down citizenship to me by descent? One interpretation might be that even though my great-grandmother was born in Quebec, that she didn't spend long enough in Canada to establish a sufficient enough connection to the point where she could pass down citizenship by descent to me. Another more liberal interpretation might be because of my own age and when I was born, that provision may be waived in my case. I don't know of the facts of that, So the good thing to do would to be ask a lawyer, especially a Canadian immigration lawyer, for advice. Another practical consideration, even if the result is the most favorable to me, is if you remember a couple of videos back, I told you how long it takes to get documentation from New York to establish these connections. It is unbearably long. And in order to establish the connection to my Canadian ancestor, I have to show the documentation from myself all the way back to my great-grandma, and that may take a very, very long time to do. So there you have it, folks, a brief history of Canadian citizenship. Say, if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.